Hi, everyone. I'm Adrienne Brodeur from Aspen Words, and on behalf of our whole team, welcome. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, Aspen Words is a literary nonprofit based in Colorado, and our mission is to encourage writers, inspire readers, and connect people through stories. And one of our favorite ways we do this is through our Writer in Residence program, which is held in partnership with the Catto Shaw Foundation. The residency provides writers the opportunity to spend a month focused only on their craft at a beautiful property in Woody Creek. It's hosted by Isa Catto Shaw, who's an artist, and Daniel Shaw, a journalist. And the program runs spring through fall with month-long residencies. While in residencies, authors are given time and space and freedom from their day-to-day obligations to focus exclusively on their writing. And their single sort of non-writing obligation is to participate in a single free event to discuss their work. For all the obvious reasons of wanting to keep everyone safe, we had to cancel our in-person residencies this year, which has felt like a big loss for our community. But luckily for us, Heather Hansman, who would have been our July resident, has agreed to participate virtually, and we are so grateful. Thank you, Heather. So before we begin, I'm gonna just go through a few housekeeping notes. Throughout this event, we will use the chat box on your screen to post links and other information. Right now, you should see a link to our virtual bookshelf with Heather Hansman's books available for purchase. And a percentage of every sale will go to support our local indie bookseller, Explore Booksellers here in Aspen. Also, we've set aside the last 15 minutes of tonight's discussion for audience questions, and you can use the Q&A feature in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen to ask Heather or Daniel a question. And you can submit these questions at any time during the talk, and we will do our best to get to as many as possible. In the spirit of supporting literary community during these very challenging times, there is no charge to enjoy this event. However, just know we do need support to carry out our mission and to sustain literary arts programming. So if you are in the position to give, please consider a donation to Aspen Words. The donation link is in the chat. And now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's guests. I'll keep it brief as their full bios are also linked in the chat. Heather Hansman is Outside Magazine's online environmental columnist, where she covers the intersection between public land, environmental policy, and human impact. Her recent book is Downriver, Into the Future of Water in the West, which she and Daniel will discuss tonight, among other topics. Daniel Shaw is a writer and musician living in Woody Creek, Colorado. He has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the LA Times on subjects ranging from the Supreme Court to fly fishing. Daniel also serves on the board of Aspen Center for Environmental Studies, and we are thrilled that he has agreed to be a jury member for the 2021 Aspen Words Literary Prize. And with that, here are Daniel and Heather.
Thanks so much, Adrienne, and thank you, Heather, and welcome to Woody Creek virtually from Seattle. And I gotta say, you're the quietest resident we've ever had. It's like you're not even here.
I haven't been picking up the garden, and I haven't been making a mess.
Yeah, no, but and so you know, we're not at Hooch, the bar where we usually have these interviews, but hopefully everyone out there, your own bar is open, and here's to all of you in Zoom land. Please drink whatever you have on hand. And I think we don't have that much time, so we'll just sort of jump right in. And again, I want to thank everyone from Aspen Words who make this possible, and at the Institute for setting this up so we can bring this to everyone. And so Heather, I just, you know, first of all, here's the book. Wait, yes. And you traveled the entire length of the Green River and took it as not just a metaphor for the water issues in the West, but it's literally key to the entire West as a lifeline, as much as the Colorado is. And you're sort of you looked at the green, it's a tributary of the Colorado. You're looking at the future as what's happened with the Colorado now, sort of is going to happen to the green, but it's still largely untouched. And I thought I'd start by asking you what it was like to transition from writing pretty short online pieces for Outside and other magazines and other venues to writing a book, and how challenging it was for you to navigate the personal narrative versus all of the information you wanted to convey. And there's so much information in here, yet it's wrapped up in this personal narrative.
Yeah, that's a good sort of big question on a couple levels, I think. And I think kind of on there's sort of like the emotional side, and then there's the like nuts and bolts, how do you write a book side. And I think on the kind of like feeling side, a book is just so much more kind of like lonely than journalism is. When you're writing, even if it's like a big magazine feature story, you're kind of always in touch with an editor and engaged with other people. And when you write a book, it's just you're on an island for so long, kind of trying to dig into it. And that was something I hadn't really anticipated in switching from kind of, like more magazine journalism into the book project. And that's sort of the same in terms of how you put it together too, I think. It's just so much bigger that it's hard to kind of hold all the pieces together in your brain, and kind of thinking about it as a whole I think that was one of the hardest parts for me, was that it felt really overwhelming, and kind of knowing how to piece it together was tricky. And you mentioned kind of the trying to balance the personal narrative and the kind of reported journalism side of it. And I think for me, in trying to write this book about water in the West, which is kind of this thing has been an issue for 100 years basically, and has been covered, I really wanted to make sure that from a kind of journalism standpoint, it was really tight, and I was able to talk about the current climate policy and talk about the history and talk about kind of why we are where we are. But I didn't want it to be snoozy, and I didn't want it to be, a lot of this kind of water policy stuff often makes people, like even people who care about it, or for me at least, it makes my eyeballs start to roll back in my head after a while. So I wanted to be something that was really sort of tangible and interesting and felt like a story, and was something that, like my mom on the East Coast could pick up and read and be interested by. So it was really important to kind of weave in that personal narrative and the kind of trip down the river and the adventure story to kind of give it some momentum and to move it forward and to give it a shape. So I think that the way I always kind of think of it, even more so than a magazine story, I kind of think about like the river trip and the narrative as like the bones of the story, and then all the kind of like reporting and background and kind of what's the actual state of water is kind of like the meat on the bones. So I think that was kind of my framework in thinking about it, and trying to wrangle this big, massive, scary first book. It's kind of trying to hold those things together.
And there are a lot of characters in the book, a lot of people we meet, but the sort of the overarching character is actually the river itself and the West itself. And did you think of it that way? Did you think of the landscape and the river as an actual living, breathing character?
Yeah, I actually really like that, because it is sort of like the main narrative. It's the thing that like holds everybody together. I think I'm kind of thinking about this is maybe, I'm going to back up a little bit because this is maybe a long story, but hopefully relevant. And when I think about other books about rivers that I love, and other kind of like stories that tell stories in ways that I really love too, I go back to John McPhee a lot, who's one of my favorite writers. And he's somebody who really thinks about structure, and he has all these sort of like, he's written about it before, he has all these kind of weird metrics for how he puts stories together. And he has one that he used in Encounters with the Archdruid, which is one of my favorite books. That's A plus B over C. And C is kind of the main character that runs through. So I think in my story, the river was kind of the C. And like everyone that I met along the way, and the people kind of each represented facet of water use that I wanted to introduce, whether that was agriculture or cities, but they're kind of all picking through the river along the way. So yeah, I think you're right. The river kind of is the biggest character.
God, it never occurred to me to have a metric on how to
Yeah.
write.
His brain is so fast.
That's why I haven't done as well as I hoped. But and I think it'd be great if you could just read just a little bit from, I don't know if you want to read from the introduction of the book, just to give people a sense of, because it does give them a sense of you and why you did this. And so if you, just a short reading would be great right now if you could do that.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe I could just read the first page or so.
Yeah,
to give people
whatever you're comfortable with, that'd be fantastic.
I'm comfortable with that. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is just kind of the first intro page. It takes place in the Wind River Range in Wyoming, just below the Green River Lakes, which is kind of the headwaters of the river. And it's the first place that you can really kind of get a boat on the river. So it's where I started. Before lunch, we hit the first real rapid, Moose Creek, a narrow, jagged rock sluice that had looked fast and pinchy when we'd driven past it the night before, peering into the gorge from the road. Now, with skimpy early season flows, there's barely enough water to split the guts of the glacially eroded granite. A few fly fishermen flick their lines into the pools above it as we pull into an eddy upstream of them to scout the rapid, looking downriver into the nash of white water. The river pillows up, then drops over a horizon line. We can't see beyond, but it looks like there's enough water to sneak our tubby little pack rafts through. Mike decides to walk around. Ben and I slide back into our boats and paddle out into the center channel. The current swells as I tee up to the top wave, pointing my bow into the break. I had been nervous, sure that I'd been off the water for too long, uncomfortable in a new boat, uncertain how my body would hold up, or whether it was stupid and stubborn to try to take a trip this long. My paddle clashes with a rock, shaking me off my line, and then I'm in the trough of the wave train, fighting to stay upright. There's a specific joy in reading water and in knowing the micro adjustments necessary to find a tongue of fast current and thread through shallow ribby rapids. And my muscle memory comes back in the quick twitch of white water. I run through clean. It's over in a flurry of frantic paddle strokes and a smack of just melted glacier to the face. Ben cleans it too and catches up to me in the slack water below the rapid. We tamp down our nervous laughs, catch our breath, turn and point our boats downstream. We're paddling through the headwaters of the Green River, the largest, most remote, and least developed tributary of the Colorado River, which brings water to nearly 40 million people across the Western U.S. It's crucial, it's overused, and it's at risk. There are deeply divisive battles over the water we're currently floating. The green starts here, in glaciated high alpine of Wyoming's Wind River Range, then winds through hundreds of miles of sagebrush flats, scrubby plains, tight gorges, and empty grasslands to the red rock deserts of Utah's Canyonlands National Park, where it meets up with the main stem of the Colorado. Because the landscape between here and there is remote and rugged, the green and its tributaries have been touched far less than most other rivers in the West, which are overtapped thanks to human population growth and decades-long drought. It's one of the only parts of the river system with significant water left to squeeze out. But all the signs of Western development, from coal to cattle to cities, are here. And as population swells in cities like Denver and Salt Lake, and as climate change shrinks stream flow, the question of how the water in this river is used and how far it can be stretched is becoming more urgent. It's a question of whether our current way of living is sustainable in a drier, increasingly crowded West, and how it will have to change if it isn't. The green is at the heart of that question, and I want to know what the answer might be. So I'm here, white knuckling my paddle on a stretch of water I've never seen before, because I decided the best way to understand it was the best way I know to understand a lot of things from the river. So that's the beginning of the adventure.
And thank you. And how did you get to this point? How did you get to the point where you had the confidence and the curiosity and the ability to take this on? Because let's face it, very few people could do what you did.
Yeah, part of it is probably like bullheaded stubbornness and signing up to write a book and then doing it. But I had been a raft guide for a long time. I started guiding when I was 18 in Maine, actually, and that's kind of what brought me west in the first place to Colorado. And eventually I kind of got hurt guiding, washed out, became a journalist. But I was somebody who kind of rivers were a really big part of my life. You know, like it was kind of a big part of my friend group and my social circle, and how I lived my life. And I still felt really confused by kind of what was going on with water. Like, you know, you hear about California's using all the water and the reservoirs are drying up. And that all felt really sort of like both like it was the most important thing that was going to impact us, and like it was really obtuse and kind of removed and hard to understand. And I figured that as somebody who was a reporter and it was my job to kind of figure out questions, and also was somebody who loved rivers, that if I didn't understand it very well, then it was probably really confusing to a lot of other people. So that to me was kind of like, I had this sort of like weird double skill set that led me to be able to investigate this. My mother was like, all those years of raft guiding finally paid off somehow. But yeah, and I think part of it was sort of like committing to a big dumb adventure too, and then having to follow through on it.
Well, you followed through in a big way, and that issue, the you said you didn't want to get too wonky in the book, and you didn't, but you got just wonky enough to sort of explain water rights and what you're just talking about now, how complicated it is. And you know, you're looking at this just going, what in the world is going on here? And all of us who live in the West, or especially the Rocky Mountain West, wonder that at one time or another. I mean, you know, we have a little pond here on our property, and they measure the evaporation rate on our tiny little pond because it's tied into a water right that goes back to the 1890s. And it's impossible to figure out really why. And so I don't want to get, again, don't want to get too wonky here, but what could you tell everyone? What was the big takeaway on water rights for you doing this project?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it's like a tricky one for even like biting into it in the first place. But my sort of like airplane level 30,000 foot view on it is that water in the Western U.S., especially in the Colorado River Basin, is broken up according to what's called prior appropriations, which basically means that the first person to put a claim to the river gets all their water before the next person in line gets any of theirs. And it goes back to mining days. It was basically so like nobody could jump in ahead of you, like upstream of you, and take all your water. And so it basically stacks out this order of water rights that is by date that everyone in the Western U.S. uses. And it's great, and it works if there's enough water to go around and everybody gets their share. But the problem is that when they divided it up, and the big sort of law of the river is the 1922 Colorado River Compact. And when they divided it up, they basically gave out more water than actually exists in the river system. So it's, there's more water allocated than actually exists. And then on top of that, climate change is making everything hotter and drier. And that's probably why they're measuring the evaporation on your pond, because we're now in what scientists are starting to call extended drought or aridity, which basically means that because everything is hotter, everything needs more water. So all the plants suck up more water. So the math was sort of wrong from the get-go. And now we're having to deal with the fallout from that as more people are moving west and as the cities are getting more crowded. So it's basically a math problem that kind of impacts how we live our lives.
And also, I mean, you said it dates back to mining days, but now it's agriculture, and there wasn't this scale of agriculture in the West at all back in
that's sort of a big part of it, is that because it's by date, a lot of the oldest water claims were agriculture claims, because that's what there was back here. And now, so ag has most of the rights to water. In some states, I think in Colorado, it's probably something like 80%. I don't know the numbers right off the top of my head. But that's not necessarily where the most people are using it, or it's getting the best use. So that's kind of this big sort of, philosophical debate about where water can potentially be best used, and how, if things are going to be hotter and drier and more crowded, and we have this framework of law, how do we ethically work within that to make sure we don't have a water crisis?
Along the way, did you encounter any place in particular, or in your research, not necessarily on the trip, but in your research, that's doing it particularly well?
Yeah, there's a lot of, I'm trying to think if there's one example of like a really interesting place. The Upper Green River in Wyoming is doing some really interesting kind of water exchange programs where people can kind of like a market for water, and that's becoming a more popular framework for how to share water and how to use it differently. And it's starting to happen a lot more, even in the past, even since I started working on the book, and I did the trip in 2016. Even since then, there's kind of been more, flexibility is kind of the big buzzword now. More flexibility in terms of people not just hardlining, I came in before you, so I get my water first. But it becomes this really sort of interesting ethical question where you're like, yeah, you have legal rights to it, but if it's not, like, is that, maybe that's the best thing for you, but is that the best thing for society? I mean, water is kind of this interesting, like, it's everybody's, and it's public and it's private at the same time.
Right. And I know you've continued to write about this. You wrote a piece for the Washington Post not that long ago. And do you have a sense of, is there any possibility that this whole system might eventually be blown up and replaced by something else? Do you think that's a remote possibility?
I think it's hard to blow, and I am not a politician and I'm not a scientist, but I think it's hard to blow the whole thing up because you need to make sure that people are getting water. Like, people need to make, we need water to live. But I think there is some movement in terms of not like blowing the whole thing to smithereens, but kind of changing how much water people get and when. When people talk about the Colorado River Basin, they talk about the basin states. There's 7 states in the basin, and they each have kind of an allotted amount of water. California has the most. California is kind of always the bad guy in water stuff. But they're now talking about California taking a little bit less than its fair share and trying to find ways to kind of share that, which would, even like 5 or 10 years ago, would have never happened. So there's not too much sort of like, dynamite the whole thing, but there definitely are some big changes happening. Good.
Okay. And to pivot, we got a little wonky there, but what was the scariest part of your journey?
I think before I got started doing the planning was sort of the emotionally scariest. There was one day where I was by myself and sort of got myself pinned in a big rapid that was scary. But I think the time I was the most freaked out, I had met a cattle rancher named Albert Summers in Wyoming, and he's sort of his family's been ranching there since the 1860s. He's kind of this like classic old guy rancher. And I had spent all day with him. He took me out to his ranch. We talked about where he got his water and cows, and I was like kind of trying to be on really good behavior. To really try to understand his perspective. And then a couple days later, I went to float through the section of river that runs through his property. And there's a little bend in the river. I missed the takeout. And it was above his property. And I ended up kind of, felt like we were been on the river for a long time. We were still floating. And then all of a sudden we were floating by his house. And I was like, oh no, I'm not supposed to be here. This is bad. We missed the car. So I ended up having to get out of the river, trespass across his field. I'm in like full dry suit, carrying my boat, running across this guy's field, get to the road, kind of hoping that I can hitchhike back to where my car is. And it's Sunday in Nowheresville, Wyoming. And I'm sitting by the road and no cars are coming. And finally a truck pulls up and it's Albert. And I was like, oh, I'm gonna get in trouble now. So I think that was the scariest point, but he was totally fine. He was very gracious about my trespassing, which is, not something you do in rural Wyoming.
No, it's not. And what would you, on the flip side of that, what if you could pin down a really transcendent moment for you in those 700 miles?
Yeah.
What would it?
So there were a lot.
There were tons of them.
Yeah, it changed so much. I had one stretch. There's a stretch between Dinosaur National Monument, kind of around Vernal, Utah, and the beginning of the Desolation Canyon section, which is sort of like empty oil and gas land. It's flat water. People don't paddle it that much. The only guy I found to talk to who had paddled it before said that all I could remember was that it was really buggy. So I knew I had this kind of 10-day stretch that sounded like it was going to be really grim. And I was by myself. That was kind of the longest stretch I was out by myself, and I was sort of dreading it. And that ended up being one of my favorite sections, just to kind of be out by myself for so long. I didn't see another person for 10 days. Saw a bunch of wild horses. I saw a bunch of wildlife. I don't know, just to be able to be out alone for that long felt really, really special.
And what preconceptions did you have about, people in this part of the world, the landscape itself, wherever that got shattered for you?
Oh, there are so many. I think the biggest one I think that I keep kind of lodged in my brain and I keep thinking about is about sort of water management and dams and infrastructure. And I had kind of come in with, the hippie raft guide attitude of like, all dams are bad, let the rivers run free, which just isn't realistic in the way that we live now. And I talked to there's two big dams on the green. There's the Fontenelle Dam and the Flaming Gorge Dam. And I had kind of cold called the manager of the Fontenelle Dam and asked if I can come check it out. And he kind of was like, yeah, sure, come, can you come now? Come in an hour. And he took me out and showed me all around the dam, which is not someplace that, people from the public normally go. There was, cat food boxes everywhere and it was not press friendly. But he just sort of explained this philosophy about how his job is to make sure that people downstream get water. And that if he's not doing his job right, they're not getting it when they need it. They don't have water in August. And just this way that all the pieces of the river, even the ones that seem sort of, lots of the parts are problematic, but even the problematic ones have a purpose to someone. And the challenge is really making sure all the pieces do the least harm they possibly can to the other parts. It's not all gonna work out perfectly. That was sort of that's one of the things I'm still wrestling with. That just because someone's thinking about it really differently than you, they're not wrong or they're not an idiot. Their perspective is just probably pretty different, which is maybe a good political lesson now too.
Yes, it's a good lesson for us all right now. This is kind of a silly question, but after you've been out west for all, could you ever live back east again?
Ooh. I've been thinking about that a lot now in the pandemic, where I feel a little trapped. I don't know, I'm from Massachusetts originally. I love New England and I miss it, especially in the fall, but I feel like I still am kind of in a little bit of a love affair with the West, which is hard to break. I don't know if that sounds a little squishy or ridiculous, but
No, it doesn't.
I don't know. Hard time. Who knows what the future is going to look like right now, so.
And I only ask that because my wife and I are from back east, and it's hard to think about going.
Yeah. Do you feel that tension between the two places?
Yeah. And it's sort of along those lines. You were going to be here for this whole month of July, working on your next book. And could you tell us what you were planning? What you're still working on it. You're just not here. But if you could fill us in on the project, that would be great.
Yeah. The new book is about, I still need a title for it. That's one of the things that I'm still trying to work on. But
maybe we can come up with one.
Yeah, maybe if people want to put ideas into the Q&A, maybe that'll help. The book is about sort of the idea of being a ski bum and living the dream, and sort of why the dream isn't as dreamy as it seems from the outside, and sort of this idea of moving to the mountains and living this life of adventure, and why people would want to do it, and then why it's potentially problematic given climate change, given sort of mental health in a lot of these places, given the economy, and sort of I'm really interested. I think it kind of goes back to that, that could you move back east? Why do people fall in love with places thing? This sort of narrative about these kind of fantasy life, fantasy life in the mountains, and this idea of I'm really interested in sort of the relationship between people and places, and why people kind of get obsessed with this idea of like being an adventurer or having to like go to big mountains. So it's sort of like the history of that idea and where it came from and what it looks like now, and then what it's potentially going to look like in the future when we don't have as much snow, or when, you know, population dynamics change, or I hadn't really planned for a pandemic, but I guess the pandemic is part of that too.
And so what, again, your rafting background led you to the Green River. So what brought you to this topic?
Yeah, it a little bit fell in my lap. And I mean, part of my personal background is that I moved, I don't know if you're supposed to talk about Vail and Aspen, but I moved to Vail when I was 21 and dirtbagged there for a long time, kind of did the classic seasonal jobs, you know, living with 15 roommates, living on ramen kind of thing. And my book agent knew that about me. She kind of knew my whole story. And she was in a meeting with an editor who was just kind of spitballing. And he was like, there's no good books about skiing. And she was like, I know somebody who knows a couple of things about skiing. So I started talking to this editor. And this was this kind of idea of like, when is the dream not the dream, was something I'd been thinking about a lot. I'd done some reporting on mental health in ski towns, and I'm always obviously kind of thinking about climate and what that does for recreation towns all the time. So this idea of like, okay, how do we, why do people, like, I got obsessed with the dream. So why does that kind of idea kind of stick for people? And what are the hard parts? Was this question that was really interesting to me. So I luckily got to dig into that.
No, it's a great subject. I don't know how many people who are currently tuned in are local or in other ski towns, but it's I think it's something we all talk about all the time.
Yeah, I know. I was in Austin for a couple weeks doing reporting on it, and there's so many things that you guys are sort of ahead of the curve on in terms of sustainability, in terms of trying to figure out housing, in terms of public transportation. But it's so hard to stay. The forces that make a place good also make it really hard. And
the mental health issues and addiction issues are so
100%.
prevalent, so real, and you know, I think you know, especially here and Vail and Jackson. I mean, we're sort of in this. It's this giant social engineering laboratory.
Totally.
Is what it boils down to, and it must be fascinating for you to dig into that.
Yeah, it is. I like the social engineering laboratory is totally true, because you have this sort of like pre-engineered idea through ski movies, through books, through magazines of like what it's supposed to look like or what it's supposed to feel like. Yep. And then you throw all these people into the stew and kind of see who makes it out alive.
So what's your favorite ski town of all you've been to?
Oh, that's such a hard question. I keep differing on the questions. I think it depends a little on the day and the people. And I love Bridger Bowl in Montana. I love Crested Butte. I love Silverton, even though that's a little bit of like I don't know if you can really call that a ski town.
I think so. I don't know what else is going on.
Yeah, there's not a lot.
Oh.
Yeah, I think I love the places that still feel a little scruffy.
Yeah.
Maybe that's sort of like the New England in me, and not growing up at ski hills instead of ski resorts. But right. I think that and I think maybe that kind of is part of the fantasy too, that part of it is like you're exploring this place that hasn't been explored yet, and you're kind of like onto something cool and underground.
Right.
And I think you go to a Jackson or something like that now, and it's hard to have that feeling, even though it is there in some places.
Aspen's really underground. No one knows. Anyone here, no one knows about it.
Aspen, I think more than anywhere, feels like a place where like all the people with real jobs are still kind of sneaking out and getting in powder days in the morning. Maybe because there's more people with real jobs there at Bridger or something like that.
We'll see if that's still the case. Anyway, that's
it's been a weird thing to think about, right now.
And would you be willing to read? I know this is a work in progress, and I don't. You can tell what you're in the editing stage right now, rewrite, editing, all of that. But could you read again a short snippet of what you've written so far?
Yeah, I can read. There's a intro section that sort of is like gives the overview, and I think I can pull out a couple little bits of that. Let me see if I can find it.
Thank you.
Yeah. And it is very, if people are listening, I'm very open to feedback and kind of the idea still. Yeah, so I'll read just a little bit about that, sort of like the backstory in the intro. For me, it flipped into a fixation, a main line for my life instead of a hobby. Skiing was the beginning, the baseline, but along the way, it became a part of my identity. It threaded through everything from the jobs I chose to the people I loved. I spent that first winter chasing the nexus of friends and storms, along with a suspended disbelief that skiing could be enough. In May, I signed another lease, and then another. Like any obsession, the reality was more complicated than the fantasy. Even calling yourself a bum is a privilege, and there's an imbalance that comes from chasing something fleeting and selfish. Getting lift tickets sucks. Ski towns and the built-up fantasy land of resorts can be havens for inequality and abuse because skiers are drawn to excess and there's plenty to go around. When I moved to Colorado in 2005, risk was everywhere, but in a way that felt exciting. I liked the brag of drinking too much, and I was too naive to notice harder drugs. Climate change felt vague and obtuse, and no one I knew had died in the mountains yet. The crash of the Great Recession hadn't shaken my generation's idea of stability, and Vail hadn't binge-bought resorts. I didn't understand the direct connection between my rampant anxiety and my relentless impermanence, and I thought living in my car was cool. I thought I could exist in the snow globe of negligence forever. But a turn only looks elegant when it's in motion. It breaks down and loses its grace if you stop moving, and ski bumming is sort of the same. The dream is that point of flexion. It exists in a liminal space between reality and gravity that's hard to hold on to. It tips into sloppy so quickly. There's an effortless ease that comes from the in-between. That's the thing we're always chasing. It's ephemeral and hard to pin down because so many of the factors are in flux. Snow and temperature, the belief that your body won't fail, and the trust that the slope won't slide out from under you.
Thank you. And that's a beautiful assessment of these places that we treasure,
Yeah.
but that are challenging and are only going to get increasingly more challenging economically and climate-wise.
And it is like, it's still something that I'm still wrestling with for myself. And I think those are the things that sort of make the most interesting. There's no easy answers. And I think that's sort of what makes it interesting to dig into, that you can't, if you're like, well, we're going to do this and then this will fix this problem. Like, I don't think that's narratively or, intellectually all that interesting.
Right.
So.
Right. And, along those lines, I mean, have you thought at all about the future? Well, first of all, the impact of environmental journalism and the future of it.
Yeah. It's a weird time to be in media, for sure. And I would say for people out there in the world, if you like reading news, pay for it. That's my big takeaway. But I think, to me, it feels really, 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 really important to be telling stories and to try to be, needling into the truth and reporting on things that maybe aren't getting covered. And, even if water stuff feels a little bit boring and wonky and too full of details, I think it's crucial to be talking about it because it impacts people's lives. And if we don't have journalists, especially on these kind of big picture environmental issues that can have a really big impact, then I think we lose this really important stopgap. And, I'm a big believer in journalism and writing as like the fourth branch of government and the thing that kind of keeps the public's eye on what's going on. And so, yeah, it does feel a little fragile right now, but it's important to me.
I know it's important to all of us, and there is a certain, because I write about this too, and there's a certain element you feel like you're preaching to the choir. I'm talking in terms of climate deniers and specifically. And did you encounter that at all in your, back to the Green River, back to the book, and also in your reporting for Outside, and you spend a lot of time talking to all kinds of people, and do you run into it, and how do you deal with it when you do, or do you think that you have the potential, because especially when you're writing about water, that it transcends that deniability or the issue at large?
Yeah, I think I definitely do run into it, and especially something like water, which because it's so crucial, I think makes people really, really emotional. Um, it can be really hard to break through those lines and to try and sort of show a different side. And I think for me, it's really important. That's part of why I wanted to peg the Downriver to people, because it felt really important to me to make that tangible and to say, you know, like, okay, when you're saying agriculture is taking all the water, what you really mean is this guy whose family has worked here for a long time is using that water, that it's not just a like, you know, nameless blob of a government agency, that it is people. And in this kind of like, I try to do that as much as I can in these kind of environmental stories, to make sure they're rooted in people and to make sure that there's a narrative and to make sure that it's not just like this bill passed and this talking head said this and like now it's all going into infinity. But it is hard. It's like there is definitely an element of, and I think that's something that feels pretty interesting about media and how we get news and how we get information now, is that it's so easy to be siloed and to just, you know, read things that you agree with, or to just kind of keep your bubble surrounded by people who are saying things that enforce what you believe. And I would love to think that, you know, journalism and reporting and storytelling has the power to change that, but I might be that might be me trying to save my own tail.
No, it does have the power to change it, because if it doesn't, then nothing will.
Yeah,
so,
I agree.
So thank you for what you're doing, and I think that's a perfect place to transition to. We have some questions from the world out there, and I will take a look at these and really quickly, and we can go through them and thank everyone. I want to thank everyone for asking questions here, and I will name you. And as I ask these, and this is from Elizabeth Nelson, who says, I'm a water policy geek. Do you discuss CAWA Section 404 mitigation in the book, or do you discuss protection of wetlands?
I don't talk about that in the book, because it was a lot of what I was dealing with in the book. This is a hard thing about trying to write about something that's as sort of like massive and, as you probably know, detailed as water policy, that it's hard to cover everything. And that ruling hadn't been, I'm trying to think about, I'm going to get the dates wrong, but that wasn't as kind of front of mind as it is now. And a lot of what I was focusing on was quantity versus quality, which is a whole nother can of worms when you talk about water. Yeah. So there's probably a whole nother book to be written about that.
Oh, there are so many books to be written, and that's something at the end. I do want you mentioned, of course, John McPhee, but I know you have some other thoughts on other additional reading for people. So we'll touch on that at the very end. But this is from Patricia Schwartz. Speaking of prior appropriations, why don't Native Americans have all the rights to all the water?
Oh man, that is such a thorny question. Basically, the high level answer to that is because the American government has hosed tribes from the get-go and has continued to do so. And I touch on that a little bit in the book when I talk about water rights in the green, which is the Uinta and Ouray Ute tribe. Is their reservation is right along the water, or along the river there. And they legally have the oldest rights on the river. And they have all tribes have what's called federally reserved water rights, which means basically they're, this is gonna get really nerdy really quickly. The US government holds our water rights instead of the states. They should be first in line. But because everything has kind of been built around their water rights and they haven't been at the table in the conversations, they've gotten screwed over. And continue to be screwed over, and that's slowly starting to change. The tribes are now at the table in the compact negotiations. They're part of the discussion, but it's really hard to kind of backwork that stuff. So that's a big, huge, that's probably the biggest overarching question in Colorado River right now.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't the longest running legal dispute in this country, doesn't it get back to the formation of the compact, and I think it was the I want to say the Navajo Nation and the maybe I don't know if it was the Hopis sued for their rights, and that is still never been settled, and it dates back to the formation of the compact.
Most tribal water rights haven't been settled. I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but there's something like 300 tribal water right cases, and like 70 of them have been settled.
Right.
Yeah.
No, it's a mess. Let's see. Here's a question from someone named Isa Catto, who
you know her?
I know her. She lives here, and which I'm very lucky to be married to Isa Catto. And she asks, wants to know, can you speak a bit to the rarefied culture of ski towns? Everyone here is outdoors focused in a variety of different ways, but there's often a disconnect between enjoying and consuming the outdoors, and understanding that we can no longer consume with impunity. And each and every one of us needs to protect our lands. How do you encourage this connection?
Yeah, that's a really cool question, I think, actually, because it's
really cool.
I was not buttering anybody up, but I think that part of, if you look back to sort of like the beginning of ski culture and the beginning of ski towns, part of the appeal of it was this idea that it was special and rare. Like the whole idea of skiing is sort of based on this idea that you're getting in on this special thing, and that you have this slice of nature that you can protect. And over the years, as that's become, like more and more people have been skiing, you can't both protect that experience and make it equitable and kind of universal and make sure everyone can have access to it. So there's this really tricky tension and I think this isn't just a ski town question. This is like a public lands question and the outdoors question, which is how do we protect the places that we care about and also make sure that everyone gets to have the same experience that we do? And I think it's a really, at some point there's going to have to be cutbacks, and we're going to have to, I'm working on a story right now about permitting on the Pacific Crest Trail and kind of trying to limit access there. And how do you make sure that's done? Do you charge people for permits? But does that mean some people can't get access? It's a tricky question. But I think it's a really important one to be thinking about.
It is. And, we're seeing it right now. We have this huge influx of people here at the moment.
Yeah.
And it's not even ski season, obviously. And it's kind of crazy. And it raises all kinds of land use issues, recreational land use.
Yeah. And that gets back into the recreational versus food production versus preserving land. Yeah. How do you kind of stack all the uses together and on top of each other in a way that is equitable in some way?
Yep. And it all puts pressure on the land and on everyone else, especially the rangers. But so here's an interesting question from Tony Canistra. Hi, Heather. I love the idea for a ski life book. I'm interested in your take on the post-ski bum transition. Many folks eventually pivot into conventional career, but others stay in communities to quote unquote make it work in a place they love, but it's hard. Has your book considered these different transitions, and what have you found?
That is like the central question of the book.
All right.
A year and a half and I'll have an answer for you. No, I think that is really like one of the biggest things that I'm thinking about, and this idea of like, when you think about a ski bum, we kind of glorify the really young people and also the really old people, but we don't really talk about the people in their, late 30s and 40s and 50s who are trying to start families and trying to hold down careers that aren't just, bumping chairs. And there isn't sort of a narrative around that. And I think, Aspen's an interesting example where I talked to some people, guys who had been Highlands patrollers since the 80s, who had been able to buy a house and start a family. And people I know now who are starting, like 20 years younger and trying to do that. There's no way we can buy a house in Aspen now. There's no way that in these kind of like small, small isolated hemmed in mountain towns, there's a breaking point. And so I think it is, it's very old person to be like, well, back in my day, you used to be able to do this. But I think there's a lot of this kind of looking back and nostalgia for when it used to be easier.
Oh, Aspen was way better in the 70s.
That's like, that's what everyone says.
Yeah. I think that's a consensus, but a cliche too.
Yeah, there's a reason for this cliche.
Let me just see if we have, I think we are, do one more question here and see if anything else comes in. But, oh, here's someone who just wants to let you know that Bridger Bowl endorsed the Bipartisan Energy Innovation Carbon Dividend Act, and hope you all know about it. It's the best first step solution to transitioning all fossil fuels. It's supported by economists and scientists as a simple, comprehensive, and effective path. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'll have to keep my eye on that, because I think it is. Yeah, like, what are the kind of creative solutions? What are we, how are we finding ways? Like Isa's question, kind of how do you kind of hold on to this thing that we all love, and also transition it and change it and make sure it's something that's going to be sustainable for as long as possible.
Yeah. And I think we're sort of coming down to the wire here, I believe. And I just wondered if there's anything else that you would like to say to everyone out here, either on the waterfront or the ski town front, because it all matters to every single person.
Yeah, I think that's totally it. It all matters. And I'm just grateful that people, I think we're all probably pretty burned out at staring at our screens right now, but that people do want to hang out and talk about books and talk about these things. Like, that makes me, kind of circling back to that environmental journalism question, like, that makes me feel a little better that people do care and people are engaged. And I think a question I've gotten a bit on the water book is sort of like, what can I do? Like, what, this feels big and paralyzing. And I think so much of it, and I think it's true of the ski town stuff too, is that so much of it kind of starts local, and like kind of looking at what's going on in your back door, in your watershed, where are you getting your water, I think is sort of this like valuable way to start plugging in. Yeah.
Oh, wait, there's
We got a question.
Oh, wait, there's one last question that just popped in. And this is from Craig Corona, who's a friend of ours, a really prominent water lawyer here, and a raft and a river rat, by the way.
Yeah, that's like,
He wants to know about the gates of Lodore and how is your run through Hell's Half Mile?
It was scary. They had the spring that I did it, it had been like a not particularly snowy winter, but then they had a really wet spring up on the green. It was like 400% of normal or something like that. So they were pumping a ton of water at a Flaming Gorge Dam, and everything was running. So it was super, super high when I went through the door. And we stood on the banks of Hell's Half Mile for probably 45 minutes and watched that rapid before we go run it. But it was awesome. That stretch of river is so beautiful, and it's really hard to get a permit. So it's a really special canyon. But yeah, it's a cool.
Oh, cool.
That's a fun question. I hadn't thought about that in a little while.
And I think let me just make sure that there's no. That's Oh, wait. We'll do this, and then I'll ask one last question. And this is from Ellie Scott. Do you have a sense of why mental health issues go hand in hand with ski town culture?
I don't have a quick answer to that. That's actually been sort of one of the most interesting things to dig into in the ski book, is sort of this, what's the correlation between anxiety and depression and being in the mountains, and are people who might be more prone to those kinds of things more drawn to those kinds of activities, or does the culture of those towns kind of feed intense anxiety-ridden culture? And I think it's sort of both. But one of the things that I thought was most interesting, I kind of talked to a lot of psychologists about, there's nobody who really exactly studies, are ski bums, more inclined to be risky or more inclined to a lot of these things, but there are some people who kind of study extreme sports and that kind of behavior. And they found that a lot of people who are excited about things like skiing have what they call antisocial behavior, which doesn't mean that you don't like people. It just means that you don't like play by the rules very well. And when I talked to the guy who was researching that, I was like, oh, that makes so much sense about so many people that I know and myself and like all these people who are kind of aren't gonna move to suburban New Jersey and live in a house with a white picket fence and are gonna kind of go run to the mountains instead. So yeah, it's a really tricky question, I think, and there are a lot of different layers and a lot of people kind of thinking about it and working on it. But I think one of the things that I saw that was pretty interesting, Alta actually has a really good program for this. They have one of the women who runs the local sort of like community center is also a bartender at one of the big bars, and she's kind of the biggest mental health advocate in town. So having these kind of community focused, hey, let's sit around and talk about the hard parts and the tricky parts with people in our community is sort of one of the things that felt the most progressive on that front and kind of got those like scary, hard to talk about, depressing things out into the world. Yeah, something I'm thinking about a lot and kind of trying to follow.
Yeah, I'm sure it's sort of there are a lot of questions. It's a chicken egg situation. I mean, are people drawn to these towns because of the risk, or are they drawn here because they're already risk takers and they want to, that's why they're here. It's really interesting, and it's and I'm glad I think your book will really resonate with so many people because it has not been addressed there's the occasional article here and there, and you've written some of them, but not at length, and it'll be fascinating. And I know we all just can't wait to see it, and I wish you were able to be here in this town to work on it. So I'm sorry.
Really sad that I didn't, even just because being, and I'm sure other people who are writers in this group, like when you're trying to write about a place, it's so helpful to be in it and to kind of get the texture and get all the pieces. So,
well,
I'll be back.
Yeah, come whatever the next project is, we will have you back. But meanwhile, just thank you for doing this.
Thank you. This is so nice to be able to talk about it and in pandemic times, be able to have conversations about this kind of thing.
Yeah. And we will get you here one way or the other once the light turns green. So
awesome.
And
thank you everyone for being here and for asking good questions and being a part of it.
Yeah, thank you everybody out there. And again, thanks to everyone at Aspen Words for putting this together. And have a good evening. All right. Good night.